The winter of 1881 killed things that were supposed to be permanent. It killed cattle that had survived 3 previous winters, animals that knew how to find shelter, how to read the sky, how to stay alive. It killed trees that had stood for decades, their trunks splitting in the night, with sounds like rifle shots as the ice expanded inside them. It killed the certainty of experienced men, men who had built solid homes with good lumber and proper windows, men who had prepared carefully and still found themselves counting their remaining firewood at 2 in the morning, with their wives shivering under every blanket they owned. But on a low hill at the northern edge of Broken Ridge, Nebraska, something was not dying. Through the white fury of that storm, a thin thread of smoke rose straight up from what appeared to be nothing more than a grass-covered mound of earth. Not from a chimney, not from a house, from the ground itself, steady and unhurried, as if the blizzard howling across the plains at 42 degrees below zero was someone else's problem entirely. This is the story of how she got there. 6 months earlier, on a morning in late June of 1880, Bessie walked into Broken Ridge carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had once held flour. She had walked most of the way from Omaha. Her shoes had worn through at the left heel. Her hair, the color of a forge fire, was tied back with a strip of cloth she had torn from the hem of her second dress. Her stomach had only just begun to show what her stepmother had called the reason for everything, and the letter that had ended her life in that house was folded at the very bottom of her bag, not because she had not read it, but because she had not yet decided whether to burn it. The letter was not a farewell. It was a warning. Do not come back. Her stepmother had written in the careful handwriting of a woman who had learned to read late in life and was proud of it. There is nothing here for someone like you anymore. Bessie had read those words 3 times on the road. Each time she had folded the letter again and kept walking. Broken Ridge was 40 households scattered across a shallow valley in eastern Nebraska, the kind of settlement that existed because the Homestead Act had told people that land was free if you were willing to fight for it. The people who had come here had fought. They had survived grasshopper plagues and summer droughts and 3 previous winters, and the pride of that survival had settled into them like hardwood dents and slow to bend. They did not trust outsiders easily. They trusted young women arriving alone with visible pregnancies not at all. The first building Bessie entered was Merritt Drummond's General Store, which occupied the largest wooden structure on the main road and served as the unofficial center of everything in Broken Ridge. It was where people bought flour and salt and nails and lamp oil. It was also where they exchanged information about their neighbors, which in a settlement of 40 households was a more valuable currency than any of those other things. Merritt Drummond was 35 years old and had been running the store alone since her husband died of summer fever the previous year. She was not a warm woman in the way that the word warm usually means. She did not offer comfort easily or smile without reason. But she had a quality that was rarer than warmth in a place like Broken Ridge. She paid attention. When Bessie walked through the door, Merritt was the only person in the room who did not immediately look away. There were 6 men in the store that morning. 2 of them examined their bootlaces with sudden intense interest. 2 others turned to face the shelves as though they had just remembered something urgent they needed to find there. The 5th man, a Norwegian carpenter named Gideon Haskell, who was 50 years old and had the hands of someone who had spent 3 decades arguing with wood, made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. The 6th man did not look away. He stepped forward. Aldrich Hollis was 52 years old, and he was the most prosperous man within 50 miles of Broken Ridge. He owned cattle and good farmland and a 2-story house with real glass windows and a porch where he sometimes stood in the evenings with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, surveying the valley below, with the expression of a man who had decided that what he could see from where he was standing was sufficient proof that the world was arranged correctly. He had a waxed mustache and a voice that had learned over decades to sound like reason, even when it was delivering judgment. "Young lady," he said in the tone a man uses when he has already decided the answer and is only performing the question as a courtesy, "this is not territory suited to a woman alone, and it is certainly not suited to a woman in your present condition. The Christian thing would be for you to return to your family and address your situation through proper channels. Bessie set her canvas bag on the floor and looked at him. My family showed me the door, sir, she said. And the Homestead Act says any citizen can claim 160 acres. Gideon Haskell let out a short laugh from his corners of the store. Work it, girl. The wind out here pulls nails from the walls. Your first winter will take you before the first snowfall. Willa Dunmore, the minister's wife, had been standing near the flower with the careful posture of a woman who considers good posture a moral position. She wore black, the kind of deep, unreflective black that seemed to absorb light rather than simply block it, and her gray eyes had the quality of arriving at conclusions before they had finished looking. She moved forward with small, precise steps. There is an orphanage in Lincoln, she said, her voice sweet in the particular way of sweetness that has another substance underneath it. You could give the child to decent people and begin again with a clean name. There is no shame in recognizing the limits of one's situation. Something hardened in Bessie's chest. Not anger exactly, something older than anger, something that had been forming in her during the weeks of walking from Omaha through the flatlands in the heat and the night sleeping under her coat. It was the thing her grandmother had tried to put into words and had only partly succeeded because some things resist words. Thank you for your concern, Bessie said. I'll be staying. The three of them exchanged a look that communicated without any of them speaking the shared prediction that this foolish girl would not see October. Bessie had $15 sewn into the hem of her skirt, which was the sum total of what she had earned in 2 years of domestic service and had managed to keep hidden from her stepmother. She knew from asking along the road that a small wooden house required at least $80 in lumber alone, not counting windows or hardware or labor. She had 15. The mathematics were not complicated. She went to Merritt Drummond and asked about land available for homestead claim. Merritt looked at her for a long moment before answering. She was, as mentioned, a woman who paid attention, and what she was paying attention to right now was a 16-year-old girl with worn-through shoes and a flour bag for luggage who had just refused to be moved by Aldrich Hollis, which was something Merritt had not seen an adult man accomplish in recent memory. There's a parcel on the north slope, Merritt said. Hard ground, no trees, no surface water. Nobody's touched it. That's because nobody wants it, Bessie said. That's correct. How much to register the claim? $14. Bessie counted out the money and pushed it across the counter. That was when Merritt did something unexpected. She reached under the counter and produced a small leather-bound notebook. She set it between them with the deliberate care of someone placing something valuable. I'll sell you supplies on account, she said. You can pay with money when you have it, but the terms aren't money. Bessie looked at the notebook. Then what are the terms? I don't know yet, Merritt said. When I figure out what I want from you, I'll come and tell you. You'll sign for it now or I won't extend the credit. It was either a trap or an opportunity. Bessie could not tell which, but she had $15, and after the land fee, she had $1 left, and she had a winter ahead of her, and she was 16 years old and pregnant and entirely alone. And sometimes the only honest answer to the question of whether something is a trap or an opportunity is that it is both, and you have to go through it anyway. She signed. Aldrich Hollis had witnessed this transaction from across the store. As Bessie was gathering her purchases and preparing to leave, he moved to stand near Gideon Haskell. His voice was low, but Merritt's store was not a large building, and Merritt Drummond was as established a woman who paid attention. She won't make it to October, Aldrich said. Gideon did not respond. He stood looking out the window in the direction Bessie had gone, his carpenter's hands still at his sides. And the expression on his face was one that would have been difficult to name, but it was not simple agreement. The parcel Bessie claimed was everything Merritt had described and less. The ground on the north slope was dense and pale, the kind of soil that looked as though the life had been pressed out of it over centuries. The grass grew low and yellow. There was no shade, no shelter from the constant Nebraska wind, no visible water. It was the land that even desperate people had passed over. Bessie spent her first 2 nights sleeping outside with her bag as a pillow, looking up at the flat black sky with its extravagant scatter of stars and thinking about her grandmother. Nana Florentine had been an Appalachian woman of mixed Cherokee and Irish descent who had spent her childhood in the hill country of Tennessee before following her daughter's family west to Ohio. She had died when Bessie was 11, but she had spent a great deal of those 11 years teaching the child things that school did not teach, things that did not have textbooks, knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes, in the particular quality of attention one paid to the earth beneath one's feet. On the third night sitting at the base of the low hill that marked the edge of her claim, Bessie let herself remember one specific thing. She had been 8 years old, sitting by the fire in the Ohio farmhouse, and Nana Florentine had been there with her weathered hands in her lap and her voice quiet in the way it got when she was about to say something she considered important. The ground under your feet is never as cold as the air, Bessie. In summer, it holds the cool. In winter, it holds the warmth. It doesn't fight the weather. It absorbs it and gives it back. If you build your house in the earth, you're not building a house. You're joining something that was already there. Bessie sat on the north slope of Broken Ridge and thought about that for a long time. Then she stood up, looked at the hill in front of her, and spent the rest of the night making calculations in the dirt with a stick. In the morning, she walked back to Merritt Drummond's store and bought a second-hand shovel for $2.50. She began to dig on the south-facing side of the hill, where the morning sun would strike the entrance directly. Not down the way you dig a well, but inward, the way an animal makes a den. The idea was to create a room inside the hill rather than on top of it, to let the earth be the walls rather than fighting against them. The work was severe. The ground was dense and uncooperative and full of rocks that had to be pried out and carried away. Bessie worked in the mornings when the soil was coolest and stopped during the hottest part of the afternoon and returned until darkness made it impossible to see the difference between earth and shadow. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and reformed as calluses. Her nails broke down to the quick. The muscles of her back burned each night with a deep, specific pain that barely let her sleep. But the hole grew. She dug a rectangular space approximately 4 meters wide by 6 meters deep, with a ceiling tall enough to stand upright in the center. She oriented the entrance to catch maximum winter sunlight and maximum protection from the north wind, which everyone in Broken Ridge agreed cut through a person like a living blade when it came down off the open prairie. The walls she sealed using a technique she had watched adobe builders use in a town she had passed through on the road from Omaha, a technique that Nana Florentine had described once as being older than any country on this continent. She mixed clay soil with cut sections of prairie grass, creating a paste she applied in layers. When it dried, it formed a surface that was hard and smooth and would not dissolve in moisture. This is what the earth does that wood cannot. At 1 meter of depth, the ground maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round, somewhere between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above is doing. In summer, when the surface reaches 100 degrees, that deep earth is cool. In winter, when the air outside drops to 30 below zero, that same earth holds steady just above freezing. It does not argue with the seasons. It simply absorbs them the way a deep river absorbs a stone dropped from a bridge, closing over it without a trace. This was the thing that Aldrich Hollis, with his 2-story house and his real glass windows, did not know. This was the thing that Gideon Haskell, with 30 years of carpentry experience and his new brick fireplace, could not have learned from any technical manual that existed in 1880. Bessie knew it because her grandmother had told her, and her grandmother had known it because her Cherokee ancestors had lived with it for generations, and that knowledge had been passed down through the female line of that family as reliably as the color of their eyes. Aldrich Hollis rode by on the third day of digging. He stopped his horse and watched her for a moment. She was covered in dirt to her elbows, her hair tied back with the same strip of cloth, her stomach visible now beneath the fabric of her dress. "What in the name of creation are you doing, girl?" "Building my home, sir." He looked at the hole in the hillside and then back at her with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit his existing categories. "That's a cave. That's a hole in the ground. Civilized people build wooden houses. Lumber for a small house runs $80, sir. I have 15 total. That's why a house costs $80. Things cost what they want for a reason. You'll live like an animal." Bessie drove her shovel into the earth and looked at him. Animals survive winter, sir. I heard 3 families lost fingers to frostbite in wooden houses last year. Aldrich Hollis's face did something complicated. He was not accustomed to being answered by young women who had just arrived in his territory with nothing but a flour bag and a claim receipt. He spurred his horse and rode away without responding. But Merritt Drummond, who happened to be making a supply delivery to a nearby farm that afternoon, had seen the exchange from a distance. She noted it in the same private mental ledger where she recorded everything that seemed worth remembering, which was most things. The digging took 3 weeks. Bessie dragged roof timbers from a dry creek bed 3 kilometers away, one at a time, each trip taking the better part of a morning. She laid them across the excavated space with a 1-meter overhang on the south side to divert rain. She layered brush and then her single waterproof tarpaulin over the timbers, and over that she piled 60 centimeters of prairie soil grass included, creating a living roof that within weeks would be indistinguishable from the hillside around it. She bought an old iron barrel from the blacksmith for $2 and had him weld its 2 worst holes for 30 cents more. This became her stove, installed in the center of the room with a metal flue pipe running up through the earthen ceiling. But before she placed the barrel, she dug a pit beneath it and filled it with large flat stones hauled from the creek bed. Those stones would absorb heat from the fire over hours and then release it slowly through the night, maintaining stable temperature long after the fire itself had gone to coals. The door she built from salvaged shipping crate wood that the storekeeper sold her for $1. It was not beautiful, but it opened inward, which meant that the pressure of winter wind would seal it more tightly rather than tearing it from its hinges. The windows were 2 openings the size of a large Bible set in the south wall and covered with oiled paper stretched over wooden frames. They admitted diffuse light and blocked the wind. She set the floor level 15 centimeters lower than the entrance threshold so that cold air, which is heavier than warm, would pool at the floor while breathable heat floated at the level of her body. She covered the floor with flat creek stones which would absorb the day's heat and release it through the night. Total cost when she counted it out in the margins of her Bible, $14.80. She had 20 cents remaining, 3 potatoes, half a bag of flour, and a tin of lard. Gideon Haskell came by with leftover lumber from a project and stood watching her with the tone of an expert observing an amateur walking toward disaster. He offered her the wood. She thanked him and declined. He shook his head. His older son laughed and said she was crazy. They left with their lumber and their certainty that she would come crawling when winter arrived. Willa Dunmore came with 3 women from the church circle carrying a basket with bread and jam and a generous portion of condescension. She spoke of the orphanage in Lincoln again, of clean names, of the limits of what the Lord expected a person to endure. Bessie accepted the bread, thanked them with a courtesy that stopped precisely at the eyes, and waited until their voices faded across the prairie. That night, she sat at the entrance to her unfinished dwelling and allowed 1 tear, then 2, to run down her face. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up her tools and went back to work. The evening before Aldrich Hollis called his meeting, Barnabas Haskell appeared at the edge of her property with a transparent excuse of looking for a lost cow. Barnabas was 14 years old, Gideon's youngest son, with his father's broad forehead and none of his father's certainty. He had a curious quality that had not yet been trained out of him, an openness to evidence that did not match his existing beliefs. He stood at the entrance and asked if he could see inside. Bessie hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. Barnabas walked down the entrance step, and his eyes went wide. "It's warm in here. It's already cold outside, but in here it feels like September." "The earth holds the summer's warmth," Bessie told him. "Same as in winter, it'll hold the cold out. It doesn't fight the weather." He touched the mud-sealed wall with his fingertips, pressing gently as though testing something he was trying to understand through his hands rather than his mind. "My father says this will collapse. Your father builds with wood. Wood fights the weather. Earth just exists in it." Barnabas stayed 5 minutes longer, asking questions she answered as plainly as she could. When he left, the expression on his face had changed from the reflexive skepticism he had arrived with to something more careful and more open. He did not know what to do with what he had seen, but he was not dismissing it. 2 nights later, he was back, and this time he was not looking for a cow. He stood at the entrance in the early dark, and his face had the particular quality of someone carrying information they are not sure they should be carrying. My father and Mr. Hollis had a meeting, he said, at the Hollis house. Other men were there too. Bessie waited. They talked about you. Mr. Hollis called it a community responsibility. He said if you wouldn't go voluntarily, they had the legal standing to intervene on behalf of the unborn child. Barnabas looked at his boots, then back at her. My father didn't say much, but he didn't say no either. For a moment, the prairie wind was the only sound between them. Are you afraid? Barnabas asked. Bessie looked at him. He was 14 years old and had risked something to come here, though he did not have the vocabulary yet for what he had risked. He had risked his father's approval, which at 14 is sometimes the whole world. Yes, she said honestly, but I'm building walls. Barnabas nodded slowly, the way a person nods when an answer is not what they expected and turns out to be better for it. He walked home in the dark, and Bessie watched him go and then turned back to her work. The confrontation came 3 days later in the particular form that Bessie had been expecting without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Aldrich Hollis and Reverend Ellsworth Dunmore came together in the official capacity of men who have decided that what they are doing is for someone else's benefit. The Reverend was a lean man with a voice trained for Sunday mornings and permanent expressions of sorrow for the condition of the world. He carried his Bible not as an afterthought, but as a tool the way a carpenter carries a level. They stood before her entrance, and Aldrich spoke first with the authority of a man accustomed to being the last word on every subject within 50 miles. This has gone far enough, he said. We've come to make arrangements. There's a women's shelter in Omaha, and the orphanage in Lincoln has agreed to receive the child. This is the sensible course, and frankly the only one available to a young woman in your circumstances. Bessie looked at him without moving. Reverend Hartman opened his Bible. Scripture calls us to protect the vulnerable, and this child you carry is the vulnerable party here. We have an obligation that supersedes your personal preferences in this matter. Bessie said, quote me the chapter and verse where it says the community may remove a child from a living mother because she is poor. The Reverend opened his mouth and then closed it again. I know that book, Bessie continued, her voice level and without heat. My grandmother read it to me every night for 11 years. I know which passages are in it and which ones people claim are in it when they want to do something they have already decided to do. Aldrich took a step forward. His voice dropped to the register that he reserved for final statements. If you will not go voluntarily, I have the means to pursue legal intervention through the county. I am trying to spare you that embarrassment. Bessie met his eyes. The thing that had been hardening in her chest since the road from Omaha was fully formed now, dense and clear as a river stone. You are welcome to try, Mr. Hollis, she said, but I will be here when you come back. The two men stood for a moment in the face of that and found that the face of it was harder than expected. Aldrich Hollis had built most of what he owned through the force of his certainty, and there was something unsettling about meeting certainty in a 16-year-old girl with mud on her hands that did not move when he pushed against it. They left. Bessie watched them go. She waited until they were far enough that they could not have seen her even if they had looked back, and then she sat down with her back against the hillside and her hands in her lap, and she cried properly for the first time since leaving Omaha. Not one tear or two, real crying, the kind that uses the shoulders. She let it run for as long as it needed to, which was not long, because she had learned from her grandmother that grief given its proper time tends to finish, and grief that is refused tends to stay. Then she wiped her face and stood up and went back to work. The home was completed in the first week of September 1880, when the cottonwood leaves along the creek were just beginning to tremble with yellow at their edges. Bessie stood before her reclaimed wood door and looked at the grass-covered mound that was her roof, indistinguishable from the hillside, and felt something that was not quite pride, but was older and more durable than pride. It was sufficiency. It was the particular satisfaction of having done an exact thing. That night, she slept for the first time under her own roof on a straw mattress she had made herself from a sewn flour sack. The silence inside the dwelling was different from the silence of the open prairie. It was enclosed silence, the silence of a space that held you rather than exposing you. There was no wind, no wood creaking against its own nature, only the occasional small sound of field mice in their corner and her own breathing. In the big house at the bottom of the valley, Aldrich Hollis's lamps went dark one by one. He had been thinking in the private way that men of his type conduct their thinking about the conversation on the hillside, about the fact that he had said what he came to say, and the girl had simply remained where she was. He was not accustomed to that outcome. That evening before the last lamp went out, he had called his wife oddly to the upstairs window. He had handed her the field glasses without explanation and pointed toward the north slope. In the dark, a small amber light glowed through oiled paper, steady and calm. Ottilie had looked at it for a long time without speaking. Aldrich had taken the glasses back. She's still up there. Ottilie had said nothing, but she had looked at the light for another moment before turning away, and the expression on her face was one that Aldrich did not quite have the right word for, though he would have had the wrong word immediately. Down in Merritt Drummond's store, the leather-bound notebook sat under the counter, with Bessie's signature on its first page, and every item she had purchased listed in Merritt's careful hand. The terms were not yet due. Merritt did not yet know what she wanted, but she was thinking about it. And across the prairie, old Obadiah Prout, who had lost 3 fingers in the winter of 1866 and had been paying attention to the natural world ever since, with the focused interest of a man who understood that it was trying to tell him something important, stood outside his small cabin at the edge of the settlement and looked at the beaver dam on the eastern creek. The dam was taller than he had ever seen it by a significant margin. He went inside, added a log to his fire, and began making preparations that a younger man or a more prideful one might have considered excessive. The beavers knew first. Obadiah Prout had been watching the dam on the eastern creek since August, and by the second week of September, it was taller than anything he had seen in 40 years of living close to the ground. The animals that build for winter do not build according to calendar. They build according to what they can feel coming, information that moves through the earth and the air, and the water and frequencies that human beings stopped listening for sometime around the moment they started building walls between themselves and the world. Obadiah was 70 years old. He had lost his 3 fingers in the winter of 1866, which had taken 4 neighbors and a great deal of his confidence in his own preparation. What remained after that winter was not fear, but a particular quality of humility, the kind that is purchased rather than inherited, and that never lets you forget what it cost. He was the only person in Broken Ridge who walked to the north slope that September to look at what the girl was building, not to judge it or redirect it, but simply to see it. He stood at the entrance with his hat in his hand and looked around the interior with the slow, thorough attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something. The sealed walls, the stone floor, the iron barrel with its flue pipe. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that this dwelling would survive what was coming better than most of the houses in the valley below. What he said was, "Your grandmother teach you this, or did you figure it on your own?" "My grandmother," Bessie said. He nodded, replacing his hat. She was a smart woman. He turned to leave, then stopped. "You have enough food," Bessie answered honestly, because Obadiah Prout was one of the very few people she had encountered in Broken Ridge who had asked her a direct question and wanted a direct answer rather than a confirmation of something he had already decided. He left without offering anything. But 2 mornings later, when Bessie opened her door at first light, there was a professional-grade rabbit snare on the ground in front of the entrance. Steel well-made, the kind that took experience to set correctly. No note, no name. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she set it exactly where it would do the most good in the narrow passage between 2 low rocks, where animal tracks had told her rabbits moved at dusk. That evening, the snare held a rabbit. It was the first time since coming to Broken Ridge that someone had treated Bessie Cresswell as a capable person rather than a problem requiring a solution. The rabbit was the gift. The snare was the real message. And Obadiah Prout, who had walked back to his own cabin and begun stacking his own winter preparations with the thoroughness of a man who did not expect mercy from what was coming, never mentioned it to anyone. October arrived the way it always did in Nebraska, with the performance of beauty that masked the threat behind it. The days were gold, and the air smelled of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. And it was possible to walk through the afternoons of that month believing that the world was fundamentally generous. The experienced settlers knew better. They knew the way a man who has lived long enough knows the difference between a smile that reaches the eyes and one that stops at the mouth. In Merritt Drummond's store, the conversations among the men took on a particular gravity. Obadiah had said his piece weeks earlier, and though no one had acknowledged it directly, the words had worked their way into the thinking of the people who heard them, the way water works its way into foundation, stone slowly and without announcing itself. Aldrich Hollis was having a new stable built. It was a substantial structure well-framed with board siding and real windows and a roof designed to shed snow load. It was costing him close to $300, and he was proud of it in the specific way he was proud of all his buildings, which was the pride of a man who equates the quality of what he can build with the quality of what he is. Gideon Haskell was adding a room to his house. He had designed it himself as he designed everything with confidence and precision, and the brick fireplace he had specified for that room had been sourced from a supplier in Kansas City. It was a beautiful fireplace. What Gideon did not yet know was that its flue design created a problem that would reveal itself only under sustained high wind from the north. Rowena Haskell, Gideon's wife, had developed a cough in late September that she described as nothing serious, and that had the character of something positioning itself to become worse under the right conditions. On the north slope, Bessie was gathering. She moved across the prairie in the mornings with a cloth bag collecting dried bison chips from the areas where the old herds had passed years before, stacking them under a rock overhang that would keep them dry through rain and snow. She gathered edible roots before the ground hardened, dried the herbs she had been collecting since August processed, and hung the meat from the rabbits her snare caught with increasing reliability as she learned the correct placements for the terrain. She did not think of this as preparing for hardship. She thought of it as paying attention to what the earth was offering before it changed its offering. Nana Florentine had told her once that people who survived difficult things were rarely the strongest in the moment of crisis. They were the ones who had done the quiet work in the time before crisis, when nobody was watching and there was no immediate reward for paying attention. Barnabas Haskell came back. He came with diminishing pretext and increasing frequency, arriving in the late afternoons after his father's work was done. He watched how Bessie moved around the interior, how she managed the fire, how she portioned her supplies with the careful mathematics of someone who has learned to treat food as a calculation rather than a comfort. "How long will your stores last?" he asked one afternoon. "Until April if I'm careful, March if the winter is hard." Barnabas looked at the organized shelves, the hanging dried meat, the clay pots of flour and salt. The arithmetic was telling him something about the difference between what this looked like from the outside and what it actually was, which was a complete system for surviving independently through a Nebraska winter. "My father is building a new room," he said after a while. "I know, I've heard the hammering. He's very proud of the fireplace." Bessie said nothing to that, which was its own kind of response. That was the afternoon Gideon caught his son returning from the north slope. Barnabas came through the door with the expression of someone who had been thinking hard and had not yet finished, and Gideon was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who has been waiting. "Where have you been?" The second of hesitation before Barnabas's answer was 1 second too many. "Up the hill." Gideon's voice dropped to the register that fathers use when they are not yet shouting, but are making clear that shouting is available to them. "Her hill. She knows things, Father. Things you don't know about how to build for winter. I'm not saying that to disrespect you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I thought you'd want to know." The sound Gideon made was not a word. He struck his son once across the face, not hard enough to do damage, but hard enough to mean something. Barnabas went quiet. Gideon turned and walked to the kitchen window. He stood there with his hands still raised at the level of his chest, not yet lowered, looking out the window in the direction of the north slope. He was a man who had built things his entire life, good things, and it had made him confident and proud, and over time less open to the possibility that the things he did not know might be more significant than the things he did. He lowered his hand. He did not apologize. He stood at the window for a long time after Barnabas had gone to his room. Ottilie Hollis came to the North Slope on a Tuesday in mid-October alone without her husband's knowledge. She wore a heavy shawl and her nose was red from the cold, and she stood before the earthen door with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not completely certain it was the right one. "Forgive me for coming without an invitation," she said, "but I wanted to see whether you were well." Bessie stood aside and let her in. Ottilie descended the entrance step, and her entire body changed. The tension she had been holding against the expected cold dissolved into a steady, enveloping warmth that asked nothing of it. "My lord," she said quietly, "it's warm." She looked around the interior with the expression of someone who has found a solution to a problem they have been carrying for a long time with recognition and something close to grief. They sat. The silence between them had the quality of silence between people who are both trying to say something they have not yet found words for. Ottilie spoke first, and what she said was not what Bessie had expected. "I lost a child in the winter of 1871. He was 3 years old. The house we had then was not what we have now. Aldrich built a better house the following spring." She stopped, looked at her hands. "The spring after that, he built an even better one, and then the one we have now. Every winter, he built something bigger and better than the one before." She paused again. "Donat has never been cold in his life. Neither have the younger boys." Bessie did not move. "But none of those houses," Ottilie said, "feel like this." She looked at the earthen ceiling, at the walls that had stood in some form for 10,000 years, before any Europeans set foot on this ground, at the fire that had burned down to steady coals 3 hours ago, whose heat still filled the room from the stones beneath the barrel. "How did you know it would work?" she asked. "I didn't know," Bessie said. "I trusted what my grandmother told me, and I watched the ground, and I did the work." Ottilie nodded slowly. Then she said the things she had come to say, the things she had been carrying since the night she had watched that amber light through the field glasses. "When it's time to deliver, don't be alone." "I don't have much choice, Mrs. Hollis." Ottilie stood and straightened her shawl. Her voice was careful and specific. "There may be more choice than you think." She did not explain. She moved to the entrance and walked back down toward the valley without looking back. Bessie sat for a long time after she left. That same week, Gideon Haskell and Aldrich Hollis met for the second time regarding what they had taken to calling the situation on the North Slope. The first meeting had produced a plan that had not been executed, partly because the legal basis required a county official 2 days' ride away, and the summer had slipped into fall, while the logistics remained unresolved. But there was a different quality to the second meeting. Aldrich arrived with his usual authority. Gideon arrived with something that was not quite doubt, but occupied the same neighborhood. Halfway through the conversation, Gideon asked a question he had not planned to ask. "If she survives the winter, then what?" Aldrich looked at him. "What do you mean, then what?" "I mean, the girl came here with $15 and built a dwelling that costs less than $15 and appears to be weathering October better than my new room. If she survives the winter, she will have proven something." He stopped. "And I think some of us will have to think about what it is she'll have proven." Aldrich was quiet for a moment, then said the thing that men like him say when not prepared to examine an uncomfortable possibility: "She won't survive the winter." Gideon went home early, claiming Rowena's cough needed attention. He stood outside his new room and listened to Rowena cough inside it, and felt something he had not felt since his early years, when every mistake taught him something no textbook contained. He felt the specific discomfort of a capable man beginning to suspect that he might not know as much as he thought. He did not go to the North Slope. He was not ready for that. November arrived and the wind came down off the open prairie with teeth. The valley's wooden houses began their annual argument with the season, and this year the argument had a different character. Merritt Drummond stood behind her counter one afternoon, watching 3 separate men come in for more lamp oil than they should have needed, and she opened her private ledger and wrote a single line without date or name, the kind of note a person makes when they want to remember that they noticed something before anyone else admitted it was worth noticing. The Hollis house consumed firewood at a rate Aldrich had always considered the natural cost of civilization, but the bills were arriving faster than the previous year. The new Haskell room created drafts that Gideon spent 2 weeks trying to trace while Rowena's cough deepened in the cold air that moved through the house despite his best efforts. The Dunmore chimney reversed in high north winds, forcing the family to choose between cold and smoke on the worst days. These were separate problems in separate houses, but Merritt Drummond, from her position at the center of everything in Broken Ridge, could see the shape they made together. She closed the ledger and thought about the girl on the north slope, warm inside a hillside, and about the notebook with its accumulating pages of credit, and about what she had decided she wanted in return. She came to the north slope on a Thursday afternoon in late October, closing the store early for the first time since her husband's funeral. She carried the leather notebook and knocked on the reclaimed wood door with the brisk knock of someone conducting business. Inside, she looked around the dwelling for a long minute before speaking. When she finally sat down, she opened the notebook and set it on her knee. "I know what I want," she said. Bessie waited. "Next spring, people will come to Nebraska. They come every spring, families from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They will have homestead claims and no money, and they will need to know how to build something that will keep them alive through the following winter. I sell supplies to those people." She paused. "I want to sell them knowledge too, paired with the supplies they'll need to apply it." Bessie looked at her for a moment. "You want to sell my knowledge? I want to establish a system where what you know becomes available to people who need it, and where both of us benefit from that system." Bessie's answer was to take the notebook from Merritt's hand, turn to a clean page, and write her own conditions in the careful handwriting of a girl who had taught herself to read from her grandmother's Bible. Her conditions were specific and fair, and left no ambiguity about credit or compensation. She handed the notebook back. Merritt read it. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not exactly a smile, but it was the closest thing to one that Bessie had seen on her face. She signed. It was the first time in all her weeks in Broken Ridge that Bessie had entered a negotiation and not been the one with less power. She felt the difference in her chest, a small and important shift. On a night in mid-November, Bessie woke at 2 in the morning with a pain in her abdomen that had not been there when she fell asleep. She lay still in the darkness and waited. The fire had gone to coals hours ago, but the stones were still doing their work, and the temperature in the room was holding. The pain came in a wave and then receded, then came again. She lay with her hand on her stomach and counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. She counted to 15 and the pain came again, and she thought with the specific clarity that comes at 2 in the morning, when you are alone and something may be happening that you are not ready for, about Audley Hollis's words. Don't be alone. There may be more choice than you think. She lay counting for 40 minutes. Then the pain stopped as cleanly as it had started, and the silence of the dwelling settled back around her, and she understood that it had been a false alarm, the body rehearsing for the real event. She lay for another 5 minutes, looking at the earthen ceiling while holding the weight of a Nebraska autumn without complaint. Then she got up, added a single handful of dried bison chips to the barrel, checked the walls by touch, in the darkness, the way she checked them every night, and went back to sleep. No one knew this had happened. No one in Broken Ridge knew that she had spent 40 minutes alone in the dark, weighing the possibility that her child was coming, with no one to help and no way to reach anyone before morning. Only the readers of this story know. And that knowledge sits differently than the knowledge of the drought or the wind or the cold or the coming storm. It sits in the specific place where the fear of being alone at the wrong moment lives, a place that most people know from their own lives, whether they have ever been to Nebraska or not. By early December, the character of the sky had changed. The angle of light was different, lower and thinner, as if the sun was conserving itself. The creek had a skim of ice at its edges each morning. Obadiah Prout had not been to town in 3 weeks. He was at home, prepared, waiting. Bessie's stores were complete. Her fuel supply would carry her through April, even in a severe winter, because her dwelling required a fraction of what a wooden house needed. She had food for 4 months, dried herbs for medicine, and the snare she had learned to use with the reliability of someone who has paid attention long enough for a skill to become instinct. On the evening of December 22nd, she came outside to bring in her last load of fuel before dark. She set down the basket and stood upright, and the sound that reached her was the sound of no sound at all. The wind had stopped, not diminished, stopped. In November and the first weeks of December, the wind had been constant, a living presence that pushed against every structure in Broken Ridge every hour of every day. Its absence was not peaceful. It was the absence of something that has always been present, the specific silence that sits before very large sounds, the held breath before the thing that cannot be stopped. She looked at the sky. It had turned the color of old bone in the west, a yellowish tone that had nothing to do with sunset and everything to do with what was behind the sunset. The birds that had remained through December were gone, not moved to a different field, gone. She went inside, added fuel more than her usual evening amount, checked every wall joint by touch, checked the flue seal, checked the door. She moved through the dwelling systematically, her hands reading the walls in the dark the way her grandmother's hands had read the pages of her Bible, finding what they were looking for by feel rather than sight. She had done everything she knew to do. The room was warm, the stones were charged, the stores were full. She sat on her wooden stool and put her hand on her stomach, where her child was living in a different kind of warmth, the first warmth any person ever knows. And she thought about Nana Florentine and about Ottilie Hollis and about the 40 minutes at 2 in the morning when she had been alone with the possibility of everything going wrong at once. Then she thought about the morning that was coming. Down in the valley, Aldrich Hollis went through his house one last time before bed, checking his 3 fires. They were all burning well. He had good firewood stacked along the side of the house in a quantity that he had considered generous when he ordered it in September. He looked at the stack now in the last light of December 22nd, and for the first time felt the edge of something he did not have a name for yet. Something that was not quite worry, but that occupied the same quiet space where worry lives before it announces itself. He went to bed. Above the valley, the sky continued its color change, slow and certain, the way all large things move. The next morning would be the 23rd of December, 1880. And what was behind that yellowish sky was already on its way. It did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a verdict. The morning of December 23rd, 1880 began with a stillness so complete that the settlement of Broken Ridge felt suspended in something other than air. No wind, no bird song. The cattle in the valley stood motionless at the edges of their enclosures as though they had been placed there by someone arranging a scene. The sky in the northwest had gone from the yellowish bone color of the previous evening to a flat, uniform gray that had no depth to it, no variation, no suggestion that anything existed behind it except more of itself. Bessie was already awake when it started. She had not slept past 4 o'clock. Something in the quality of the silence had pulled her up from sleep the same way a sudden sound would have. Because sometimes the absence of a thing that should be present is louder than any noise. She had her fuel loaded and her water stored and her door sealed before the first needle of ice came in sideways off the open prairie. That was what it was initially, not snowflakes. Ice needles driven horizontal by a wind that had apparently been saving itself for exactly this moment. A wind that arrived not as a gust, but as a sustained force, like a hand pressed flat against every exposed surface in the county and simply held there. By noon, the temperature had dropped 25 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, it was impossible to see 3 meters in any direction. The world outside the entrance of Bessie's dwelling had become a single, undifferentiated roar of white and cold, and the entrance itself reduced that roar to a distant sound, present but not threatening the way thunder sounds when it is several counties away. Inside, the stones were warm. The barrel ticked quietly. The temperature held. Bessie sat on her wooden stool and sewed a small wool cap for the child she was carrying, and listened to the storm try to find a way in, and felt it fail. In the valley below, the Hollis house was experiencing what large, well-built wooden houses experience during sustained assaults of extreme cold, which is that they reveal themselves to be collections of small gaps. Every joint between boards, every space around a window frame, every imperfect seal around a door becomes a channel for cold air, And those channels multiply across the surface of a two-story house until the interior begins to feel less like a protected space and more like a slightly warmer version of the outside. Aldrich had his 3 fires running at full capacity by mid-afternoon. His oldest son, Donat, and his 2 younger boys were taking turns maintaining them, rotating through the house every 2 hours to keep the wood supply moving. By evening, Aldrich did the calculation he had been avoiding, counting what remained against what the night would require, and arrived at a number that made his jaw tighten in a way his sons had not seen before. He did not say anything to his family that night about the calculation. He added a log he had not planned to add and sent everyone to bed. In the Haskell house, Rowena's cough had worsened through the afternoon as the temperature dropped and the drafts found her wherever she positioned herself. Gideon moved her from room to room, chasing warmth that was always slightly ahead of where they were. The new room with its Kansas City fireplace had been sealed off entirely by evening because its flue design created a reverse draft under sustained north wind that filled the room with smoke faster than the fireplace could warm it. Barnabas Haskell sat in the main room and listened to his mother cough and listened to his father move through the house with the specific sound of a capable man encountering the limits of his capability. He was 14 years old and he understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to young people precisely because they have not yet learned to protect themselves from understanding that there was a place not far from where they were sitting that was warm and safe and that his mother needed it. He did not say this to his father. Not yet. In the Dunmore house, the smoke problem had become critical within 6 hours of the storm's arrival. Every attempt to sustain a fire resulted in smoke filling the house. They had tried sealing the chimney throat entirely, which solved the smoke, and introduced a cold so penetrating that Reverend Dunmore's youngest daughter, 9 years old, began crying with the specific flat crying of a child whose pain has moved past the sharp stage. Her feet, the toes of her right foot had gone white and then mottled purple before her mother wrapped them in every available cloth and held them against her own stomach for warmth. The first night passed. In the morning of December 24th, the storm did not moderate, it intensified. Aldrich Hollis stood at his bedroom window and scraped a circle in the frost with his thumbnail, enough to see out. The visibility was perhaps 5 meters. He could not see the stable he knew was 40 meters away. He scraped the frost circle wider, angling to look toward the north slope, and for a long time he saw nothing but white. Then he saw it. A thread of smoke, thin as a pencil line, rising straight up from the hillside. Straight up, which meant it was not being torn apart by the wind, which meant it was coming from somewhere protected enough that even in this storm, the draft was clean and steady. It rose and then the wind took it sideways 50 meters up, but at the source it was steady and it was there and it had been there all night and it would be there when his firewood ran out sometime tomorrow. He called to his oldest son. Donut came to the window and looked where his father pointed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The smoke thread was impossibly calm against the violence of everything around it. I was wrong, Aldrich said. He said it the way a man says something he has been building toward for months without knowing he was building toward. It's something that comes out with the particular flatness of a thing that has been compressed for too long. About the girl, about what she built. I looked at it and I saw what I expected to see instead of what was there, and I was wrong, and I need you to know that. Donut was 22 years old. He had grown up watching his father be certain about everything which had appeared from the outside to be the same as being right. This was the first time he had heard the other sentence. He did not know what to do with it yet, but he stored it with the careful attention of someone who understands that certain things heard once change the way you see everything that came before them. What do? Donut asked. Aldrich turned from the window. We wait for a break in the storm. Any break at all. And then we go up that hill. The break came in the early morning of December 25th, a 2-hour lull between the first phase of the blizzard and what the older settlers would later recognize as its more sustained second phase. The wind dropped from a sustained howl to a moan, and the visibility opened to perhaps 30 meters, which was enough. Gideon Haskell had been awake since 3 in the morning with Rowena. Her cough had moved into her chest in the way that chest coughs move settling deep, and she had a fever now low but present. And Gideon understood that warmth was not a comfort for her anymore. It was a medical requirement. He wrapped her in every blanket they owned and lifted her and walked out into the lull. He did not wake his sons. He went alone. And the reason he went alone was the same reason a man sometimes drives to a difficult destination by himself, because there are certain admissions that are easier to make without witnesses. And what Gideon Haskell was about to do was the largest admission of his professional life. He reached the North Slope entrance and stopped. Bessie heard the knock and opened the door to find a man she had last seen walking away from her dwelling with the absolute confidence of someone who had never needed to return. He was standing in the diminished storm with his wife in his arms, and his face had the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. He did not preamble it. "I have nowhere else to bring her." Bessie looked at Rowena, checked her breathing and the color at her lips, the way she held her own weight, even wrapped in his arms. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Put her close to the barrel," she said. "East side." Gideon carried Rowena inside and set her down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he is afraid of losing. He straightened up and stood in the center of the room, and then he did something that told Bessie more about him than anything she had observed in the months since her arrival. He put his hand flat against the sealed earthen wall and stood there for a long moment, not looking at it, just feeling it. 30 years of carpentry, 30 years of building things the only way he had known to build. His hand on that wall was the hand of a man having a conversation with a fact he had refused to acknowledge until the fact refused to be refused any longer. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Bessie put water on to heat. They arrived in 3 separate groups within the following 2 hours, drawn by the same calculation that Gideon had made, the arithmetic of survival overriding everything else. The Hollis family came together. Aldrich first, then Ottilie, then Donat, and the 2 younger boys. Aldrich stopped in front of Bessie with the field between them, the long field of every word he had said since June, and he stood in it for a moment before he crossed it. "My boys are cold," he said. "We have no more wood." Ottilie was behind him, and when Bessie looked at her, Ottilie gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since October and had kept its possibility alive through the intervening weeks without telling anyone she was doing it. Bessie stood aside. "Come in." The Dunmores arrived 10 minutes after the Hollises. Reverend Ellsworth carried his daughter, whose feet were wrapped in cloth and whose face had the flushed, papery look of a child who has been cold long enough for it to change her. Willa walked behind him, and the thing that struck Bessie most about Willa Dunmore's entrance was the silence of it. There was no announcement, no framework of scripture or social obligation placed around the act. She walked down the entrance step and sat down on the floor next to the barrel without speaking, and held her daughter's wrapped feet between her own hands. Meredith Drummond came last alone, an hour after the Dunmores, pushing through the second phase of the blizzard that had resumed while the others were settling in. She arrived with a bag of hard bread, which she set down without ceremony, and with something else, the leather notebook. She sat in front of Bessie and opened it to the first page where Bessie's signature was. She turned pages slowly, each one listing purchases, dates, amounts, the complete record of what Bessie had bought on credit over the past 6 months. Then she began tearing the pages out one at a time and dropping them into the barrel where the fire was burning low. Each page took about 4 seconds to become heat. "Dead is clear," Merritt said. "That wasn't the arrangement," Bessie said. Merritt looked up on her with the direct, assessing gaze that had characterized every interaction they had ever had. "No, it wasn't. The arrangement was business." She looked around the room. 14 people in a space built for one. 14 people who were alive because of something this girl had known and done and built with her own hands when every person in this room had told her she was wrong. "This is something else." There was a pause between them. Then Bessie nodded. The room held 14 people. It was crowded in the way that a lifeboat is crowded, which is to say that no one in it had any interest in complaining about the crowding. Bessie managed the space with the systematic calm of someone who had been in some essential way preparing for exactly this, even if she had not known she was preparing for it. The children near the barrel, Rowena Haskell in the warmest position available, the men around the perimeter, the women in the middle. She prepared tea from her dried herb stores and passed it in her single cup, refilled repeatedly. She warmed flat creek stones in the barrel and wrapped them in cloth and distributed them to the people whose temperature she was most concerned about, beginning with Rowena and the Dunmore girl and working outward. She did not say, "I told you." She did not say you should have listened. She did not arrange her generosity in a way that required acknowledgement of her rightness. She simply did what needed doing with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned from a woman with weathered hands in a slow voice that the earth takes everyone in without asking whether they deserve it. On the second evening, with the blizzard in its deepest phase and the temperature outside reaching 42 below, Aldrich Hollis and Reverend Dunmore had the argument. It was not a large argument. It was the kind of argument that happens between two men who are both accustomed to being the authority in every room they occupy and have suddenly found themselves in a room where neither of them is the authority at all. It was about something specific and unimportant, the question of where one of the Hollis boys was sitting relative to one of the Reverend's family members, but the specific content was just the surface of it. Underneath was the pressure of 2 days of cold and fear and the very new and very uncomfortable experience of being wrong about something that had mattered. Barnabas Haskell was sitting 4 feet from where the argument was happening. He was 14 years old, and he watched the two men the way young people watch adults behaving badly, with a clarity that the adults have lost access to. His expression did not change. He simply watched. Aldrich saw the boy watching him. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. He looked at Barnabas, and what he saw in Barnabas's face was not judgment or contempt. It was something more patient and more damaging than either of those things. It was the look of a young person who has already decided what kind of man he does not want to become and is in the process of having that decision confirmed. Aldrich sat down. "I apologize, Reverend," he said into the silence that followed. "That wasn't necessary." Reverend Dunmore looked at him for a moment, then at the floor. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Bessie, who had not looked up from what she was doing, quietly asked Donat Hollis to help her move the fuel supply from the exterior alcove to the interior shelf. He went immediately, and the moment passed. Later, when most of the room was sleeping, Barnabas came and sat near Bessie. The fire was low and the stones were doing their work, and the temperature in the room was holding stable, as it had been for 2 days. "Why did you let us in?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Bessie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the only way she had ever answered Barnabas's questions. "Because turning someone away from warmth when you have warmth is a choice I would have to live with," she said. "And because my grandmother taught me something that took me a long time to understand. She said the earth doesn't ask whether you deserve to come in. It just holds the door open. I learned from the earth." Barnabas was quiet for a moment. "My father touched the wall today, for a long time." "I know. I don't think he knew he was doing it." "Sometimes that's how people learn the most important things," Bessie said, "when they stop meaning to." Barnabas looked at the earthen ceiling dark above them, holding the weight of a foot of snow and the temperature of the season and everything the storm could deliver, holding it all without complaint, without drama, without any interest in being acknowledged for holding it. He reached out and pressed his own palm flat against the wall beside him, held it there. On the morning of the third day, the blizzard exhaled its last breath and stopped. The silence it left behind was total, the specific silence of a world that has been remade overnight. Everyone in the dwelling heard it at the same moment, the cessation of the sustained roar that had been the background of every moment for 60 hours. People who had been sleeping woke up. People who had been awake sat up straighter. Bessie opened the door. The world outside was white from one horizon to the other, the kind of white that has its own light reflecting the early sun in a way that made the eyes ache. The snow was to her knees in the open space before the entrance, deeper in drifts against the hill behind her. The sky was a blue so saturated it looked painted the specific blue that appears after extreme storms, as though the sky is trying to compensate for what it just did. The temperature outside was still 20 below zero, but the wind was gone, and without wind, 20 below is survivable in a way that 42 below in a gale is not. And everyone who came out of that dwelling into that brilliant cold morning understood the difference in their bodies before they understood it in their minds. They stood in a loose group looking down at the valley. The Hollis stable, the large new one that had cost close to $300, had lost its roof. Dark shapes in the white snow around it told a story that Aldrich did not walk toward. He stood on the hillside and looked at it from a distance and did not speak. The Haskell house stood, but the new room's roof had a visible sag at its eastern corner. One window on the north face had been pushed inward by ice expansion, leaving a black rectangular opening that had been admitting outside air for an unknown number of hours. The Dunmore house had lost a section of its front porch and a piece of the main roof over the parlor. The chimney that had caused such difficulty had a visible crack in its exterior stonework. Bessie turned and looked at the dwelling behind her. The snow had drifted up against the south face of the hill and covered the entrance overhang entirely, so that the only indication anything was there was the entrance step just visible and the thin flue pipe rising from what appeared to be a natural hillside. The grass on the roof had been compressed by the snow into something denser and more uniform. There was no structural damage. There was no evidence of stress. The earth had absorbed 60 hours of assault at 42 below zero and had simply continued being the earth. They left in stages by family as the morning warmed toward the merely very cold. Gideon Haskell went last among the men, having made sure Rowena was stable enough to walk with assistance. He stopped in front of Bessie before leaving, and the thing he said was not a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. "I built things my entire life," he said. "Good things, things I was right to be proud of." He paused. "And I built this winter wrong. The new room, the fireplace, I built it the way I've always built. And the way I've always built was not wrong exactly, but it was not complete." He looked at the hillside. "I'd like to understand what I was missing. When you're ready to talk about it, I'll listen." It was the most professionally significant sentence Gideon Haskell had uttered in 30 years, and both of them knew it. "Come in the spring," Bessie said. "Bring your notebook." He nodded. He went. Aldrich Hollis was already down the hill with his sons when he stopped and turned back. Audley had been waiting for this with the patient certainty of someone who knows a person well enough to know what they will eventually do. He walked back up to where Bessie was standing. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually last, which is what happens when a handshake is doing the work that words have not been found for yet. "I said you wouldn't survive October," Aldrich said. "Then I said you wouldn't survive the winter." He stopped. His voice had the quality of a man working with an unfamiliar tool. "I was wrong both times about the dwelling. About you." He paused once more. "About what a person is capable of when the people around them are too certain to look properly." He went down the hill. Donut, waiting at the bottom, fell into step beside his father, and Aldrich put his hand on his son's shoulder as they walked, and the gesture had the weight of everything that had been said at the frost-scraped window 2 days before. Willa Dunmore was the last to leave. Her daughter was walking now carefully, the color back in her face. Willa stood before Bessie in the bright winter morning and was quiet for a moment that stretched past the length of comfortable silence into something more honest. "I came to your property twice," Willa said. "And both times I told you what you should do with your life. I told you it as though I had the authority to know." She stopped. "I didn't have that authority. I assigned it to myself, and I used it to make things harder for you than they needed to be." She looked at Bessie directly. "I'm sorry." Bessie let the silence after that apology be what it was. She did not rush past it. She looked at Willa Dunmore, at the woman underneath the black dress and the assigned authority, in the gray eyes that judged. In what she found, there was a person who had been genuinely frightened of something she did not know how to name, and who had turned that fear outward in the direction of a 16-year-old girl who could not fight back. "It's done," Bessie said. "Not forgiven exactly in the formal sense. Something more complete than forgiveness. Finished. Set down. Over." Willa nodded once and took her daughter's hand and walked down the hill. Merritt Drummond had already gone characteristically without ceremony or conclusion, slipping away, while people were occupied with their own departures. She had left the bag of hard bread. She had not waited to be thanked. Bessie stood alone before her dwelling in the winter bright morning and looked at what the storm had done and not done, and at the valley where the community of Broken Ridge was returning to itself after the worst night in its collective memory, and she felt a particular quality of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from having been fully present in something large and demanding. She put her hand on her stomach. 8 months and counting. The child moved a slow, deliberate pressure from inside, the kind of movement that feels like a statement. Spring came in the way Nebraska springs come, which is to say not gently. It came in fits warm days, followed by late frosts, mud that froze overnight and thawed again by afternoon, the ground cycling through states until it finally committed to warming and stayed there. Gideon Haskell came in March, as he had said he would, with a leather-bound notebook in the posture of a man who has settled something with himself in the intervening weeks. He sat on Bessie's floor and wrote down what she told him, the practical specifics that built on what Barnabas had already relayed. The ratios for the wall mixture, the minimum depth requirements, the roof loading calculations, the stone placement under the barrel. He asked good questions. His questions were the questions of an expert in a related field encountering a different tradition of expertise, and the conversation between them had the specific quality of productive argument, two capable people working toward the same understanding from different directions. 30 years, he said at one point, not bitterly, but with the evenness of a man who has completed an accounting. I built houses that kept the weather out mostly. You built a house that let the earth in. I was solving the wrong problem. He came back twice more that spring, and by April he had built a modified version of Bessie's principles into the repair work on his damaged room, and the improvement in his house's temperature stability over the following months was a fact that he mentioned to every settler who asked him about his work without exception, and when he mentioned it, he always said where the knowledge had come from. The child was born in April. Ottilie Hollis arrived at the North Slope at first light on the morning that Bessie's labor began in earnest, as though she had been waiting for the signal, which in some sense she had. She had been checking in weekly since February, the visits having evolved from the tentative first one into something that looked less like charity and more like the early stages of a friendship between two women who had found unexpectedly that they had things to say to each other. Rowena Haskell came an hour later, recovered her chest clear, in the warming spring air, walking up the hill under her own power. She and Ottilie had already established the practical division of labor between them in the conversations they had held in the intervening months, which was another thing that had grown from the 3 days in the earthen room, the way things sometimes grow from extreme circumstances when the people involved are honest about what they need from each other. Merritt Drummond came and held the lamp. The labor was long, and it was real in every sense that word carries, and Bessie met it the way she had met everything since June, by paying attention and doing what could be done and accepting without theater what could not be controlled. Ottilie was steady, Rowena was experienced. The room held its temperature without being asked to. The child arrived in the late morning, a boy, and when Ottilie placed him on Bessie's chest, the sound he made was the sound of someone who has just discovered that the world outside the first warmth is large and cold and full of information, and has decided provisionally to investigate it. Bessie held him and did not try to govern her own face. Everything she had held at a certain distance since Omaha, the grief of the closed door and the long road and the town that had told her to leave, and the winter that had tried to kill what she was building, all of it moved through her in one long wave that she did not block. Ottilie's hand was on her back. She let herself be held the same way her dwelling held everything else, completely, without condition. She named him Daniel. In the weeks that followed, things in Broken Ridge changed in the way that communities change after shared extremity. Not all at once, not completely, but in specific ways that accumulated into something new. Aldrich Hollis sent a cow. He arrived with it himself, leading it up the hill on a rope, and the transaction was completed with minimal conversation, which was the appropriate amount. The cow had a calf that spring, and the milk changed Bessie's daily calculation from sufficient to comfortable. Gideon Haskell made a cradle. He worked on it for 3 weeks, which was longer than any piece of furniture he had made in years, because he was making it the way you make something for a person you owe a debt to that cannot be measured in lumber and nails. When he delivered it, he said nothing about the debt. He set the cradle down, touched Daniel's cheek once with one rough finger and left. Barnabas came more often that spring. He was genuinely useful in ways that his age and the season permitted, carrying heavy things, digging the early garden beds that Bessie had planned for the grass roof above the dwelling, learning without being explicitly taught. He had the quality of a young person who has decided on a direction and is moving in it with the specific momentum of someone who has figured out early what kind of knowledge matters. By summer, the roof garden was producing. The depth of soil above the dwelling, combined with the stable temperature below it, created growing conditions that surprised even Bessie, and she had expected the garden to do well. The roots went deeper than surface gardens. The yields were consistent. People noticed. Meredith Drummond began selling the concept alongside the building supplies exactly as she had proposed, and she began every such conversation exactly as she had agreed. The knowledge belongs to Bessie Cresswell. What I'm selling you is the material to apply it. On a morning in June early, before the heat of the day had arrived, Bessie sat in the entrance of her dwelling with Daniel sleeping against her chest in the cloth carrier she had made during the worst weeks of the previous autumn. The valley below was green and ordinary, in the way that places are ordinary when they have returned to themselves after doing something extreme. The houses stood where they always had. Smoke rose from morning fires. A dog crossed the road at the bottom of the valley. Somewhere a hammer struck the ground in the particular rhythm of deliberate construction. On the hill directly adjacent to hers, Barnabas Haskell was digging. He had started the previous week after asking her two specific technical questions and then going away to think about her answers before returning with his shovel. He was building for a family that had arrived in May from Indiana, people who had a homestead claim and no money, and a winter ahead of them that would be their first, and they had paid Barnabas in labor, which he had decided was sufficient. He worked with a focused quiet that Bessie recognized because it was the same quality of attention she had brought to that hillside 11 months before, the attention of someone who has found the specific thing they know how to do and is doing it in the full understanding of why it matters. She watched him work and felt Daniel breathe against her chest, slow and even. The breathing of a person who has not yet learned to doubt the world's fundamental capacity to hold them. Nana Florentine had put her hand on the ground outside their Ohio farmhouse one evening when Bessie was 9 years old and had said something that Bessie had not fully understood then. She understood it now, sitting in the entrance of the home she had built with $2.50 and 3 weeks of work and the knowledge that had been passed to her through the female line of her family, like a river passing through every kind of ground without losing itself. The earth doesn't ask you to earn your place in it, Nana Florentine had said. It already made room for you before you arrived. All you have to do is accept the room. Bessie had accepted the room. She had been told she would not survive October. She had survived October and November and December in the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Nebraska territory, in a birth attended by 3 women who had at various points believed she was either foolish or immoral, or both. And she was sitting now in June sunlight, with her son breathing against her heart, and a boy on the next hill carrying her knowledge forward into the next winter, and the winter after that. And the knowledge itself was older than any country on this continent, older than the names people had given to the land, older than the arguments about who owned it, old as the earth that had held its warmth through every winter that had ever come steadily without drama, without requiring acknowledgement. It had held her. She held her son. The hammer struck on the hillside beside her, rhythmic and sure. And the smoke from her morning fire rose straight up into the blue Nebraska sky, thin and steady and calm, exactly as it had risen through every storm.